Things that the notion of people uniting voluntarily to meet a common economic, social, cultural need or an aspiration. That's what the credit union is all about. That's what cooperatives are all about. And cooperatives started over 100 years ago here in Canada. And the credit union that I actually work for, Omista, they started over 76, 77 years ago. Program all about, and Darlene did a great job of telling you about it. It's an innovative mechanism for sharing Canadian knowledge and skills to strengthen credit unions in developing countries. The program does take a hands-on approach where volunteers from Canadian credit unions would help in partner credit unions. In Africa, they're called SACCOs, to identify areas for improvement and to help them boomerang into the future. So what we did is, this is a group of 12 of us who actually went over. 6 went to Malawi and 6 went to Uganda. And when we got to Uganda, we worked in groups of 2. So if you look in the back, the big tall guy with the blue shirt on was my coaching partner. His name was Charlie. By Kenya, Sudan, Rwanda, Tanzania, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And its capital is Kampala City. And it is located right at the equator. So if you want to know if it was hot when I was there, absolutely. You saw there is just shy of 31 million people. Million. That's a lot of people in a small area. 85% of those people are Christians, but their life expectancy is 45.3 years. The rule of Idi Amin in that country produced massive economic decline. And just as of February 18th of this year, they just went through an electoral process which kind of created a bit of unrest and nervousness within that country. But things went along smoothly, and they now have a new ruler in Yoweri Museveni. It is rampant in that country. It has killed over 1 million people, and 59% of those are women. A few facts about the women in Uganda. The women definitely have fewer rights than men. They have fewer opportunities for education. If there were 2 people applying for a spot at a university, a man and a woman, the man would get it every time. Didn't matter what her qualifications was, whether her ability to pay, the man would get it over the woman. She does have to work much harder than the men, and I'm going to show you a couple of pictures that will show you. Also, the women are often abused in that country, and believe it or not, men do still take multiple wives in that country, and so they're often considered to be a possession rather than an individual. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. So first I'm going to tell you about a young lady I met in 2009, and her name was Rita. And Rita is a manager of the Zerogwe Sacco. And Rita was quite an individual. She kind of had a different perspective because there's a second program that's done through the Canadian Cooperative Association. The one I participated in was where I went over to Africa and participated by giving coaching. But there's also one where the women of Africa, Mongolia, Ghana, they'll come over to Canada and they'll spend a month here in Canada. So they spend 1 week in Ottawa learning about Canada, our culture, the way things are done, about the whole cooperative system. And then they partner with a credit union somewhere in Canada. And Omista has been privileged to have 4 different women over the years come and stay with us. And actually my husband and I billeted one of these women the last time that was done. But Rita did come to Canada, and she spent time in the Ontario area. And when she was here, she said, I got to meet so many people. I got to meet everybody's family. I got to go to a school. I got to see so much. So when the Canadians, or as they call us there, the Mzungos, which means the white person, when the Mzungos came, she was so proud of her community and really wanted to show us off and show her community off. So a couple of things that she did. She first took us to meet this lady, and this lady is Rose. And Rose is a member of her SACO. Now Rose, when we met her, she was actually doing very well, but a few years prior to that, she was not so well off. She was left widowed with only a small piece of land, a tiny little house, and 7 children to feed. Rose, of course, her first concern was she needed to feed her children. So thankfully she had the little plot of land and she knew how to grow tomatoes and a little bit of corn. So she felt, I could feed my children, but I know that my children need protein in order to build strong and healthy bones and all. So she knew she had to do something. So what did she do? She went down the street and she saw Rita at the SACO. And she said, I have 3 goals. I want to feed my children, I want to send them to school, and I want prosperity for myself. So the first thing she did is she borrowed money to purchase 50 hens. So that 50 hens would provide eggs to feed her family, which was a source of protein. And then secondly, she could sell the excess eggs to have some funds to hopefully send some of her children to school. So she took a small loan. To us, it would be a very small loan. It would be the equivalent of about $100 US. She took that out, and over a year, she was able to pay that loan back. Then she went back to the SACO, asked for another loan, and got 50 more. Then she went back and got another loan and got 100 more. Well, 3 years after that first loan, she now has 700 hens. She's now feeding her children, bringing a steady income in, and as of that time, she was telling us that she now has 4 buildings to house her hens. All her children are going to school, and this right here is a picture of her next project. What she's doing is very innovative and very, it just blew me away when I saw this. She knew she needed water for her hens. So she went and she saw an engineer and they erected these containers. So she takes the rainwater from her buildings, and you'll see she has little troughs running into these containers. And that's how she's taking care of her hens and her small garden. So when you kind of look at what that small little SACO has done for her, she is very grateful because she says, I'm feeding my kids, I'm sending them to school, and I'm the boss. She wanted us to meet the teacher of the primary school in her village. She had the opportunity to visit schools here in Canada, so she was proud to take us to the schools in her community. And this particular lady that she's standing there with is Madame. I never did find out what her name was beyond that. It was always Madame. And I assume that's because there were so many children around and it was a big respect thing, so it was always Madame. So Madame knew that her community needed a school because in Uganda you have what's called the government schooling system. The government schooling system will pay for children to go to school up to what they call P3, which would be similar to our grade 3 or grade 4. The problem is those schools are very poorly put together. Often you've got hundreds of children in this tiny little school area. You've got a teacher. That teacher may or may not be paid, and most times that teacher is uneducated. So they knew their community needed a real school. So what they did, Rita and Madame, they got together and they formed what was called a group organization. And they wanted to have a school for their community. So if you look in the background and you see the tiny little building with the 2 doors and 2 windows, that's what they started with. So they started out, they had, I think they said they had 50 students in that little room, if you can imagine. One side for boys, one side for girls. And then slowly the organization, they got the community behind them. They started charging fees for the students to come to school. And then you see the building along the side is the next building that they built. Well, again, it's been about, from what I was told at that time, it had been about 4 years. She now has 6 buildings. She employs 8 teachers and pays them well and has over 700 students. So that just goes to show you what two women putting their mind together and coming up with a need for their community can do. So you see these children here, they're all actually, they were so well behaved when we were there. It was just amazing. So then Rita continued to take us on a journey. It was quite the journey too, as you can see the roads here. This is pretty much our road conditions most of the time. And she took us through the center of town. So this is the town that they're servicing here. And one thing she was particularly proud about was the little well you see off to the side in this picture. The reason she was so proud of this well was because her credit union, her SACO, donated the funds to install that well. Prior to that, the center of town didn't have any water. They had to go out into the hills where you would see literally 5-year-olds carrying like 2-liter jugs on their heads, carrying water and taking it home. They'd do this, they'd go on the way to school or wherever it was they were going to play, and they'd carry these jugs on their head. Well, this helped the women of the community immensely because they weren't out hauling the water for the fields, they weren't hauling the water for the home. So this is right in the center of town, so she was very, very pleased to show us this. Then she took us to the village where she grew up. Of course, Canadian hospitality, we want to introduce everybody to our families and welcome them into our homes and have a nice meal for a visitor. So she took us to this tiny little community, and she showed us that this is where she grew up, these buildings here. Her whole family, she said there was about 20 of them throughout the generations that all grew up in these little homes. But then we went around the corner a little bit and we saw this beautiful house. So it was modest, but it had a tin roof. It did have a concrete floor rather than a dirt floor. And there we met her mother and her grandmother. Now this is one part that I still to this day can't believe actually happened, but we walked into their living room and you'll notice the grandmother sitting down. I guess that would be to Rita's left. She's actually on her knees. We walked into the room and she would not get off her knees. And they invited us to sit on this lovely couch. She would not get off her knees. And no matter how much coaching we did, she said she was so thankful to the Canadians for what they had done for her granddaughter that it would be terribly disrespectful for her to stand in our presence. It was very humbling, let me tell you. Finally, in the end, when we did leave, she did come out to the front step and wave goodbye to us, but it was quite something. So, but Rita, with what she's been able to do in her community, for her mother, for her grandmother, she's brought them out of that little house that you did see into this home, and that's all because she persevered.